The sun over the valley had a certain gentle quality in the late afternoons, a soft, golden light that seemed to apologize for the harsh brightness of midday. It was a light that loved old things, that poured itself over the weathered wood of a small, solitary cottage and the bowed shoulders of the woman who lived inside. Her name was Anya, and if the sunlight was gentle, it was because it recognized a kindred spirit in her, a quiet, fading warmth that persisted against the long, cool shadows of evening. Inside the cottage, the silence was a physical presence. It lived in the corners of the room. It sat in the empty chair opposite hers at the small wooden table, and it echoed with the memory of a voice that would never again call her name. She was a widow, a word that sounded as lonely as it felt, a title that spoke of an absence so large it made the world feel hollow. Her husband's passing had left her not only with a grief that was a constant, aching companion, but also with a practical problem: how to survive. And so, she did what she knew how to do. With hands that were still clever and steady, she sewed. She mended torn trousers for the shopkeeper in town. She took in frayed cuffs on shirts for the schoolteacher, and she carefully stitched closed the ripped seams of dresses for farmers' wives. Her needle would dart in and out of the fabric, a tiny silver fish in a sea of cloth, and with every stitch, she earned just enough to keep a roof over her head and a meager supply of food in her cupboard. It was a life of quiet endurance, a cycle of waking, working, and sleeping, all set to the soundtrack of a profound and unending silence. Many miles away, where the valley opened up into wide, rolling pastures, was the Blackwood Ranch. It was a handsome spread of land, with a sturdy barn, corrals for the horses, and a large ranch house that should have been filled with laughter and life. But a shadow had fallen over it a year prior, a shadow from which the man who owned it all, Thomas Blackwood, could not seem to escape. He was a rancher, a man used to solving problems with his own two hands, fixing a broken fence, pulling a calf from a struggling cow, wrestling a heavy feed sack onto his broad shoulders. But the problem that now haunted his home was one his strength could not fix. His wife, the bright and loving center of their universe, had been taken from them by a sudden fever, leaving behind a silence in the house that was even more deafening than the one in Anya's cottage, because it was filled with the echoes of two heartbroken children. His son, Ben, was 8 years old, and where there was once a cheerful, curious boy, there was now a small, serious shadow who tried too hard to be the man of the house when his father was away. His daughter, Lily, was just 5, a little girl whose sunshine had been clouded over by a sadness she was too young to understand. She clung to her father's legs and rarely spoke above a whisper. Thomas tried. He truly did. He would come in from a long day of work, his body aching, and attempt to cook supper. More often than not, it would be burnt or undercooked, and they would eat it in a silence broken only by the clinking of forks. The house was falling into disarray. Dust gathered on the shelves, laundry piled up in baskets, and the feeling of a home, a real home, had vanished as completely as the woman who had created it. The children's clothes were often rumpled and sometimes had small tears. One afternoon, Thomas noticed a particularly large rip in the elbow of Ben's favorite shirt. The boy had tried to sew it up himself with clumsy, large stitches, and the sight of it, this small, sad attempt by his son to be strong, broke something inside Thomas. He wasn't looking for a new wife. His heart was still too sore for that. But he was desperate for help. He needed someone to simply cook and clean, to bring a semblance of order back to their lives, to make sure his children had a decent meal and clean clothes to wear. He needed a housekeeper, nothing more. It was the town's postmaster, a kind old man who saw the worry etched on Thomas's face, who mentioned the widow in the valley. Lives alone, she does, the postmaster said, sorting through envelopes. Quiet as a mouse. But her hands, they work miracles with a needle and thread. I reckon she can cook just as well. Does odd jobs to get by. Name's Anya. It was a slender thread of hope, but Thomas clung to it. The next day, he hitched up his wagon and made the journey to the far side of the valley, the wheels kicking up dust on the lonely road. When he arrived at the cottage, he saw a woman hanging laundry on a line, her movements efficient but weary. She turned to look at him, and he was struck not by her beauty, but by the quiet dignity in her eyes, a dignity that seemed to have been forged in the same fires of loss that had scorched his own family. He removed his hat, feeling suddenly awkward, a large man intruding on a world of profound quiet. "Miss Anya," he began, his voice softer than he intended. "My name is Thomas Blackwood. I own the ranch on the other side of the valley." He explained his situation, stumbling over the words. He spoke of his children, of the messy house, of the burnt suppers. He was careful, so careful, to make his offer purely about work. "I'm not looking for anything else," he said, his eyes earnest. "Just a cook and someone to keep the house. Just for a little while. My children, they miss a home-cooked meal. I can pay you fairly for your time." Anya listened, her hands still holding a damp shirt she had been about to pin to the line. She looked at this large, sad man standing in her small yard, and she saw not a rancher, but a reflection of her own loneliness. His loss was different, surrounded by children and land, but it was the same essential loneliness. Her heart, which had felt like a small, closed fist for so long, softened just a little. She knew what it was to need a helping hand. She knew the emptiness of a silent table. She nodded slowly. "I will come," she said, her voice quiet but clear. "I will come to cook and to clean. For a little while." She packed a small bag with her few belongings, including her sewing kit, and climbed up into the wagon beside him. She looked back only once at her quiet cottage as they drove away, the wheels carrying her not just across the valley, but toward a destiny she could never have imagined, leaving the deep silence of her own grief behind to step into the echoing silence of another's. The journey from the quiet cottage to the Blackwood Ranch was a slow, rolling transition of landscape and light, the wagon creaking a steady rhythm that seemed to measure the distance between Anya's old life and whatever this new arrangement was to be. Thomas, a man of few words, pointed out landmarks with a gentle nod of his head. A particular oak tree that had been struck by lightning years ago but still stubbornly clung to life, a bend in the river where the water ran deep and quiet, good for fishing if one had the time for it. Anya listened, her eyes taking in the vastness of the land, so different from the closed-in feeling of the valley where her cottage sat. The air here smelled different. It was laced with the dry, sweet scent of prairie grass, the musky odor of cattle from a distance, and the clean, sharp smell of pine carried on the wind from the distant hills. It was a working ranch, a place of purpose and industry, and the sheer scale of it was both intimidating and, in a strange way, comforting. Here, life was not measured in the tiny, silent stitches of a seam, but in the turning of the seasons, the birth of calves, the harvesting of crops. It was a life that moved forward relentlessly, and Anya found herself wondering if perhaps some of that forward momentum might somehow brush off on her own still heart. When the ranch house finally came into view, it was both grander and sadder than she had imagined. It was a two-story structure of weathered timber and stone, built with obvious care and love, designed to shelter a large and happy family. A wide porch wrapped around the front, begging for chairs and the laughter of people relaxing at the end of a long day. But the windows, many of them, had a blank, vacant look to them, as if the soul had gone out of the place. The yard, while tidy, lacked any personal touch. No flowers grew by the steps. No toys were scattered in the grass. It was a house waiting for something or someone to bring it back to life. As the wagon rolled to a stop near the hitching post, the front door opened just a crack, and two small faces appeared in the shadowy gap. Thomas climbed down from the wagon seat, his boots crunching on the gravel. "Ben, Lily," he called out, his voice striving for a cheerfulness that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Come on out now. There's someone I'd like you to meet." The door opened wider, and the children emerged slowly, cautiously, as if stepping into a world that had proven itself to be untrustworthy. Ben, the 8-year-old, stood protectively slightly in front of his younger sister. He was a smaller version of his father, with the same serious brow and sturdy build, but his eyes held a wariness that was far too old for his young face. He looked at Anya not with curiosity, but with a kind of quiet assessment, as if determining whether she was a new problem to be managed. Little Lily, who was 5, practically hid behind her brother's legs, peeking out with one wide, blue eye. Her hair was a messy tangle of blonde curls, and she clutched a worn, cloth doll tightly to her chest, its face smudged and faded from love. Anya did not move from her place by the wagon. She did not rush forward to greet them or try to force a smile that would not have been believed. She understood that to these children, she was not a potential friend. She was a stranger, an interruption in their world of grief, a reminder of the mother who was no longer there to greet newcomers at the door. She simply offered a small, gentle nod, a silent acknowledgement of their presence and their right to be wary. Thomas shifted his weight, the awkwardness of the moment palpable. "Children, this is Miss Anya. She's going to be helping us around the house for a bit, with the cooking and such." Ben gave a single, short nod, a miniature man accepting a business arrangement. Lily just stared, her grip on her doll tightening. "Why don't you show Miss Anya to the kitchen, Ben?" Thomas suggested, eager to break the tension with action. Without a word, Ben turned and went back inside, expecting them to follow. Anya picked up her small bag and followed Thomas into the house. The inside was exactly as the outside promised. Spacious, solidly built, but filled with a hollow silence. The furniture was good quality, but dusty. A blanket was folded messily over the back of a sofa. There was a coldness to the hearth, not just because there was no fire, but because it felt unused, unlived in. It was a house, but it was not a home. It was a shell. Ben led them to the kitchen, a large room with a big iron stove, a heavy wooden table scarred from years of use, and shelves lined with empty jars and dusty crockery. The room felt dormant, like a heart that had stopped beating. Anya set her bag down on a chair and looked around, her practical eyes taking inventory. She saw the layer of flour dust on the counter that hadn't been properly wiped, the stack of dishes in the dry sink, the empty pie safe. This was a kitchen that had once been the warm, bustling center of a family, and now it was just a cold, messy room where people came to eat unsatisfactory meals. Thomas stood by the door, looking helpless. "I'm afraid we're not much set up for," he began, gesturing vaguely at the room. Anya turned to him and then to the children, who were watching her from the doorway. She ignored the mess. She ignored the dust. She went straight to the heart of the matter. She walked over to a large ceramic crock on the counter, lifted the lid, and peered inside. There was flour. She opened a smaller tin and found honey. She turned to the children, her voice calm and matter-of-fact, devoid of any false sweetness. "I thought we might make some honey biscuits today," she said. It wasn't a question. It was a simple statement of what was about to happen. It was a purpose. Lily's eyes flickered with a tiny spark of interest at the mention of honey. Ben just watched, his arms crossed. Anya did not ask for help. She did not tell them what to do. She simply took off her shawl, hung it on a peg, found a clean apron hanging on a hook, and tied it around her waist. She moved with a quiet efficiency, gathering bowls, measuring out flour, slicing a knob of butter from crock she found in the cool pantry. The clatter of the bowl, the scrape of a spoon, the sound of her movements, they were small sounds, but they were sounds of life, and they seemed abnormally loud in the silent house. Soon, the rich, nutty smell of baking flour and melting butter began to warm the air. Then came the sweet, fragrant scent of honey being stirred into the mixture. Anya worked in silence, but it was a different kind of silence now. It was a productive, focused quiet, not the empty void that had been there before. She kneaded the dough, her hands strong and capable, then rolled it out and cut it into rounds with the edge of a glass. She stoked the fire in the stove, learning its quirks and temperament, and soon had it at just the right temperature. As the first batch of biscuits began to bake, a magical transformation began to occur. The warm, sweet, comforting aroma of baking bread and honey started to seep out of the kitchen. It drifted into the parlor. It floated up the staircase. It pushed back against the cold emptiness of the house. It was a smell deeply connected to memory, to safety, to love. It was a smell that had been absent from the Blackwood Ranch for a very, very long time. Thomas, who had been pretending to look over some accounts in the next room, found himself drawn back to the kitchen doorway, lured by the scent as surely as if he'd been called by name. Ben had uncrossed his arms and was watching, mesmerized by Anya's capable hands. Lily had taken a few tentative steps into the room, her doll held loosely now, her nose in the air, sniffing. When Anya opened the oven door to pull out the first golden brown, perfectly risen batch of biscuits, the smell that poured out was overwhelming. It was the smell of a home. That night, for supper, Anya served a simple stew she had simmered while the biscuits baked, but nobody really remembered the stew. What they remembered, what they focused on, were the baskets piled high with warm, fluffy honey biscuits. They ate them with butter, they dunked them in their stew, and for the first time in a year, the kitchen table at the Blackwood Ranch did not feel like a place of sad duty. It felt, for just a moment, like a place where a family was eating a meal together. No one spoke much, but the silence was no longer hollow. It was simply quiet, and for now, that was enough. The house, for the first time that day, felt not quiet but peaceful. The following morning, a new and unfamiliar rhythm began to establish itself within the walls of the Blackwood Ranch house. A rhythm dictated not by the mournful silence of the past year, but by the quiet, purposeful movements of the widow, Anya. She was a woman of her word, and her word had been to cook and to clean, and so she set about these tasks with a focused diligence that was both impressive and, to the inhabitants of the house, somewhat awe-inspiring. She was like a gentle but persistent tide, washing through the rooms, and with each pass, some small part of the accumulated grime of grief and neglect was slowly, patiently scoured away. The dust that had settled like a shroud on the mantelpiece was wiped clean with a damp cloth. The windows, which had for so long looked out on the world with a film of gray, were polished until they shone, allowing the full, brilliant light of the valley sun to pour into the parlor, illuminating dancing motes of dust that were now in the process of being banished. The floors were swept and then scrubbed on hands and knees, the water in the bucket turning a murky brown, evidence of the long months of inattention. Anya did not sing as she worked, nor did she hum. Her labor was a silent offering, a meditation performed with brush and broom and rag. Yet, to say she only cooked and cleaned was to describe a symphony by listing the instruments. It missed the essence of the music entirely. For Anya's true nature revealed itself not in the grand, sweeping tasks, but in the small, almost invisible kindnesses she performed without any expectation of thanks or even notice. These acts were like seeds planted in fallow ground, small and hard and full of a latent potential for life. One afternoon, Ben came in from attempting to help his father mend a fence, his face smudged with dirt and his expression one of frustration. He went to change his shirt and discovered a long, jagged tear in the elbow of his favorite flannel shirt, the one his mother had given him on his last birthday. His shoulders slumped. It was a final, small defeat on a difficult day. He balled up the shirt and shoved it into the bottom of his wardrobe, trying to forget about it. 2 days later, when he went to get dressed, the shirt was there, folded neatly on top of his chest of drawers. He picked it up, puzzled. There, on the elbow, was the most perfect, nearly invisible mend he had ever seen. The tear had been closed with such tiny, meticulous stitches that it looked less like a repair and more like an intentional part of the fabric's design. He ran his finger over the smooth seam, a confused gratitude welling up in his chest. He never mentioned it to anyone, but he wore the shirt the next day and the day after that, and each time he looked at that mended elbow, he felt a strange, quiet sense of being seen. For Lily, the kindnesses were different. One morning, Anya found the little girl sitting on the bottom stair, struggling to brush the tangles from her mass of curly hair. Her small face was screwed up in concentration and frustration, and she was on the verge of tears, yanking at the knots with a comb. Without a word, Anya sat down on the step beside her. "May I?" she asked softly, her hand held out for the comb. Lily, after a moment's hesitation, handed it over. Anya's touch was impossibly gentle. She worked through the tangles with a patience that seemed infinite, starting from the very ends of the hair and moving slowly upward, holding the strands tight at the root so it wouldn't pull on Lily's scalp. When the last knot was free, she did not simply hand back the comb. Instead, she began to part the hair with her fingers, her movements sure and practiced, and she braided it into two neat plaits that hung down over Lily's shoulders. It was a style Lily's mother had often done for her. When Anya was finished, she handed Lily a small, polished metal hand mirror from her own bag. Lily looked at her reflection, her eyes wide. She touched the braids, a small, almost forgotten feeling of being cared for settling over her. Later that day, Anya was in the kitchen when she felt a small presence beside her. She looked down to see Lily, holding out the cloth doll. One of its button eyes was hanging by a thread. The request was silent, but it was the most significant thing the little girl had communicated since Anya's arrival. Thomas was not exempt from this quiet campaign of compassion. He had once, days before Anya arrived, muttered to himself in frustration after a long day, staring into the nearly empty pantry. "I'd give a North 40 for a slice of a good blackberry pie," he'd sighed, a throwaway comment to the empty room, a fleeting memory of a sweetness from a happier time. He had forgotten he'd ever said it. But Anya, who seemed to hear everything, had been in town the day before, trading her sewing for supplies, and had acquired a few precious jars of put-up fruit from the previous summer. 2 days after his comment, on the table after supper, next to the usual pot of tea, sat a perfect, deep-dish blackberry pie, its lattice-top golden brown, dark purple juice bubbling slightly through the gaps. Thomas had stared at it as if it were a ghost. He ate 2 slices that night, and the taste was so exactly right, so perfectly reminiscent of comfort and contentment, that it was almost a physical ache. He didn't thank her for the pie, not in so many words. The gratitude was too large and too complicated to fit into a simple thank you. Instead, he simply met her eyes across the table and gave a slow, solemn nod, which she returned with equal gravity. It was an understanding. Each evening, after the supper dishes were washed and put away, after the children had been sent upstairs to ready for bed, Anya would perform her own small ritual. She would take a worn shawl from its peg, go out onto the front porch, and sit in the old rocking chair that overlooked the vast, darkening ranch. She would rock slowly, back and forth, her gaze fixed on the emerging stars, and in these moments, the quiet dignity she carried would soften into something more vulnerable. She was still a lonely woman, sitting alone in the vastness of the night, her own grief a familiar cloak around her shoulders. She was not yet part of this family. She was a satellite orbiting its edges, drawn by its gravity but not yet pulled into its center. From the window of his room upstairs, Ben would sometimes watch her. He saw the way she looked at the stars, not with wonder, but with a kind of quiet conversation, as if sharing her sorrows with them. Lily, from her own window, would see the solitary figure and be reminded of the feeling of a mother's goodnight kiss, a memory so faint it was like a dream. They watched her, these 2 wounded children, and without realizing it, they began to see past the title of the help and started to see the woman. They saw her kindness, her gentle ways, her unending patience. And in the deep quiet of their own hearts, they began to feel the first faint stirrings of a new, terrifying, and hopeful thought, the thought that perhaps this emptiness did not have to be forever. The days on the ranch began to settle into a new, fragile pattern, a tapestry woven with threads of routine and the small, colorful strands of Anya's quiet kindnesses. The house itself seemed to breathe easier, its rooms filled with the smells of baking bread and simmering stews instead of dust and neglect. For the children, this new normal was a strange and delicate thing. Ben found himself listening for the sound of Anya's footsteps in the hall, a steady and reassuring rhythm compared to his father's heavy, weary tread. Lily had taken to following Anya at a distance of a few paces, a silent, small shadow, studying the woman's every move, mesmerized by the way her hands could transform flour and water into pillowy biscuits, or how a length of thread could become a perfect, invisible mend. Yet for all this gradual thawing, a core of ice remained within each of them, a deep, frozen fear of hoping for too much, of trusting this new stability only to have it shattered. That core was most protected in Lily, and it was symbolized by a single, precious object. The object was a small wooden bird, no larger than the palm of her hand. It was not a fancy toy. Its paint was chipped in places, faded from years of loving handling. But its value was immeasurable. It had been carved for her by her mother in the final weeks of her illness, a final act of love poured into the soft pine. Her mother's hands, though weakened, had shaped the wings, painted the bright blue breast and the tiny, knowing black eye. It was the last piece of her mother she could hold, the last tangible connection to the voice that sang lullabies and the hands that offered comfort. The bird was never far from Lily's side. It ate with her at the table, perched on the edge of her plate. It slept on her pillow, watching over her dreams. It was her confidant, her silent witness to a world that had become terrifyingly large and empty. One afternoon, a particularly bright and cheerful day that seemed to mock the solemnity inside the house, Lily was playing on the porch. She was orchestrating a grand adventure for the blue bird, helping it soar from the seat of the rocking chair to the safety of the porch railing, her small voice whispering the dialogue of its heroic journey. Ben was nearby, whittling a stick with a pocket knife, casting occasional glances at his sister, a faint smile on his face at her absorption. Anya was inside, the steady, rhythmic sound of her kneading bread dough providing a soft soundtrack to the afternoon. Thomas was still out in the far pasture. It was, in its way, a moment of perfect, peaceful equilibrium. The tragedy was both swift and mundane. In a moment of exuberant flight, the wooden bird slipped from Lily's grasp. It tumbled through the air, striking the edge of the porch step with a sickeningly sharp crack before landing in the dirt below. The sound was not loud, but it was absolute. The entire world seemed to freeze. Lily's playfulness vanished, replaced by a look of pure, uncomprehending horror. For a second, there was only silence. Then, a small, choked whimper escaped her lips, followed by a wail of such profound and utter devastation that it seemed to tear the very air apart. It was not the cry of a child who had broken a toy. It was the sound of a heart breaking all over again, of a final, precious connection being violently severed. Ben was at her side in an instant, his own whittling forgotten. He scooped up the pieces from the dirt. The damage was catastrophic. The bird had not just cracked, it had shattered. The body was in 3 large pieces, and the delicate wing was splintered into several more. It was beyond repair. "Lily, it's okay," he said, his voice tight with his own panic, holding the fragments in his cupped hands as if he could somehow will them back together. But his words were useless, a tiny raft against a tidal wave of grief. Lily's cries escalated, becoming raw, ragged sobs that shook her entire small frame. She was inconsolable, lost in a pain that was far too big for her. The commotion brought Anya to the door, her hands still dusted with flour. She took in the scene in a single, sweeping glance. Ben's desperate, helpless face, the shattered pieces of wood in his hands, and most of all, Lily, utterly destroyed by a loss that to anyone else would seem small, but to her was everything. Thomas, drawn by the sounds of distress, came riding up to the porch at a gallop, leaping from his horse before it had fully stopped. "What happened? What's wrong?" he asked, his voice sharp with alarm. He saw the pieces in Ben's hands, and his face fell, understanding dawning immediately. He knelt before his weeping daughter, his large, work-roughened hands gentle on her shoulders. "Oh, sweet pea. Oh, no." He took the fragments from Ben and examined them, his brow furrowed in concentration. Maybe we can glue it," he said, his voice full of a hope he clearly didn't feel. He carried the pieces inside, Lily clinging to his leg, her sobs now reduced to miserable, hiccuping whimpers. For the next hour, the kitchen table became an emergency ward for a broken heart. Thomas cleared a space, found a pot of strong glue, and with immense care and a frustrating lack of dexterity, tried to fit the pieces back together. But the breaks were too complex, the pieces too small and splintered. The glue smeared on his fingers, making them stick together, and the fragile fragments refused to hold. Each failed attempt felt like another blow to Lily, who watched with wide, hopeless eyes, fresh tears tracking through the dust on her cheeks. Ben tried to help, holding pieces steady, but his own frustration mounted. He tried to distract his sister, making a silly face, offering her his own whittled creature, a clumsy-looking horse. She turned her face away, burying it in her father's shirt. The atmosphere in the room was thick with despair. They were all failing her. They could not fix this. Throughout this entire ordeal, Anya had not interfered. She had moved to the sink, quietly washing the bread dough from her hands, her back to the struggling family, giving them space. But she had heard every heartbreaking sob, every whispered word of failed encouragement. She understood that this was not about a toy. This was about the physical manifestation of a mother's love lying in ruins on a kitchen table. When it became abundantly clear that Thomas's efforts were only making the situation more hopeless, she finally turned around. Her expression was not one of pity, but of deep, empathetic understanding. She walked over to the table and knelt down, so she was at eye level with Lily, who was still hiding her face. She didn't reach for the child. She didn't offer empty words of comfort. She simply sat there, present in the shared space of their grief. After a long moment, she spoke, her voice so soft it was almost a whisper, yet it carried through the room's tense silence. "That is a very special bird," she said. It was a statement of fact, an acknowledgement of the immense value of what had been lost. Lily peeked out from behind her father with one red-rimmed eye. Anya's gaze then shifted to the heartbreaking jigsaw of wood and glue on the table. She looked at Thomas, not with judgment, but with a quiet request. "May I take these?" she asked softly. "I would like to try." Thomas, defeated and helpless, nodded mutely, pushing the collection of fragments toward her. He couldn't imagine what she could possibly do that he had not already failed at. Anya gathered up every single splinter, every tiny shard, with the reverence of an archaeologist handling sacred bones. She placed them all carefully on a clean white cloth, folded it into a neat parcel, and without another word, she took it and went upstairs to her room, leaving the fractured family in the kitchen surrounded by the lingering smell of glue and failure. That night, long after the house had fallen into a troubled sleep, a single candle burned in the window of Anya's room. Inside, she was at work. The pieces of the blue bird were laid out on the small table before her, a devastating puzzle. Her sewing kit was open beside her, but she was not using thread. She had fine wires, tiny clamps whittled from wood, and a strong, clear adhesive she had brought from mending china. Her movements were painstakingly slow, her breath held as she fitted two minuscule splinters together, holding them perfectly aligned for minutes until the glue set enough to release them. She wasn't just gluing, she was rebuilding, reinforcing from the inside with tiny splints made from matchsticks, filling gaps with a mixture of glue and sawdust she had collected from Thomas's workshop, sanding it infinitesimally smooth between each step. It was an act of immense patience and profound respect. She was not just fixing a toy for a little girl. She was, in her way, performing a sacred act of restoration, honoring the love with which it had been made by pouring her own quiet love into its repair. The cracks would always be there, a map of the breakage, but her mission was to make the bird whole again, to prove that something shattered could still hold together, could still be beautiful. The candle burned low as she worked, her shadow a steadfast guardian on the wall, diligently piecing hope back together, one tiny, fragile fragment at a time. The morning after the great shattering arrived with a peculiar and heavy quiet. The sunrise painted the sky in soft hues of rose and gold, but its beauty felt distant, unable to penetrate the gloom that had settled over the Blackwood Ranch house. In the kitchen, Thomas moved with a somber tread, building a fire in the stove with more noise than was strictly necessary, the clatter of the iron door closing like a gunshot in the hushed dawn. He had slept poorly, his dreams haunted by the image of his daughter's devastated face and the feeling of his own large, clumsy hands failing to mend what was broken. He had prepared himself for a day of sorrow, for the sight of Lily's red-rimmed eyes and the continued absence of her most cherished companion. Ben came down the stairs quietly, his expression sober. He had heard his sister's soft crying long into the night. a sound that made him feel both fiercely protective and utterly powerless. He glanced toward the empty spot on the shelf, where the wooden bird usually perched during meals, and felt a fresh pang of guilt, as if he should have been able to prevent the accident. The atmosphere was one of collective mourning, a shared understanding that a profound loss had occurred, and that the world, for little Lily at least, had become a darker place. They expected her to be withdrawn, perhaps to refuse to come downstairs at all. When they heard her small footsteps on the stairs, both Thomas and Ben looked up, their faces etched with concern. Lily appeared, her face pale and her eyes downcast. She was clutching her cloth doll, but it was a poor substitute. She moved like a ghost to her usual chair at the kitchen table and climbed onto it, not looking at anyone. Her small shoulders slumped in defeat. She seemed smaller than she had the day before, as if the tragedy had physically diminished her. It was then that Anya entered from the pantry. She carried a tray with a pot of oatmeal and a pitcher of milk. Her expression was as calm and unreadable as ever, but there was a faint weariness around her eyes, a testament to the long hours of meticulous labor she had undertaken in the secrecy of her room. She did not look at Lily directly. She simply set the tray down and began to prepare the breakfast bowls. The routine was normal, but the silence was oppressive. Thomas dished out the oatmeal, the scrape of the spoon against the pot unnaturally loud. Just as he set a bowl in front of Lily, Anya turned back from the counter. In her hands was a small object. She did not present it with a flourish or a dramatic announcement. She simply walked over to the table and, with the same quiet efficiency with which she did everything, placed the mended wooden bird on the tablecloth beside Lily's bowl. Then, she turned away immediately to fetch the honey, as if she had done nothing more remarkable than deliver a spoon. For a long, suspended moment, nothing happened. Lily's gaze, which had been fixed on the blank wood of the table, drifted sideways. She saw the bird. Her breath hitched. It was a tiny, almost silent sound, but in the quiet kitchen, it was deafening. Slowly, as if afraid it might be a mirage that would disappear if she moved too quickly, she reached out one small, tentative finger. Her touch was feather-light, tracing the line where the worst of the breaks had been. She expected to feel rough, gummy glue, the evidence of her father's failed attempt. But her finger met only smooth, sanded wood. She picked the bird up, her movements now more urgent, turning it over and over in her hands, her eyes wide with a disbelieving intensity. The bird was whole. It was undeniably the same bird, with its familiar chipped paint and the shape her mother's hands had carved. But now, its history was written upon in fine, elegant lines. The breaks were still visible, not as ugly scars, but as a delicate web of fine, dark seams, where Anya had used a mixture of glue and carefully applied stain to highlight the repairs rather than hide them. The bird had not been returned to its former self. It had been transformed into something new. It bore the map of its own breakage and its miraculous healing. It was, in its way, even more beautiful than before, because it was a testament to the fact that something could be shattered and still be made whole again. It was a monument to resilience. Lily's lower lip began to tremble. She looked from the bird in her hands to Anya's back, as the woman calmly stirred honey into her own oatmeal. The emotions that crossed the little girl's face were a storm: confusion, awe, a dawning, staggering realization. This was not just a fixed toy. This was a message. This was proof that the woman with the quiet hands understood things that were too big for words. The tears that welled up in Lily's eyes this time were not of despair, but of a profound, overwhelming gratitude that cracked open the icy core of grief within her. With a choked sob that was half cry, half joy, she slid from her chair. The wooden bird clutched safely in one hand. She ran across the kitchen floor and did something she had not done since her mother died. She threw her arms around Anya's legs in a fierce, unconditional hug, burying her face in the woman's apron. The effect in the kitchen was seismic. Thomas froze, a spoonful of oatmeal halfway to his mouth, his eyes wide with stunned emotion. Ben stared, his own heart performing a strange, aching flip in his chest. He saw the repaired bird. He saw the absolute trust and love in his sister's embrace. And he remembered. He remembered the perfectly mended tear in his favorite shirt. He remembered the patient help with his sums at this very table, the way Anya never made him feel foolish for not understanding. He remembered the braid in his sister's hair, the blackberry pie for his father. He saw, in one blinding flash of clarity, that every single action had not been about doing a job. It had been about caring for them. It had been about love. The meal continued in a silence that was now charged with a new, powerful energy. Lily climbed back in her chair, the bird placed proudly beside her bowl, and she ate her breakfast without another tear, her posture straight, the weight of the world visibly lifted from her tiny shoulders. Later that day, Thomas found Ben in the barn, brushing down his horse with unusual intensity. The boy looked up at his father, his young face serious. "Papa," he said, his voice clear and sure. "The house, it doesn't just feel clean when she's here." He struggled for the right words, words big enough to hold the feeling. "It feels like a home again." Thomas looked at his son, and in the boy's eyes he saw not a child, but a young man who had witnessed a miracle of the heart and understood its value. He placed a hand on Ben's shoulder and nodded, his own throat too tight for speech. The mended bird sat on the kitchen windowsill, catching the morning light, no longer just a toy, but a silent, powerful symbol of a healing that had begun not just in wood, but in the hearts of everyone who lived under that roof. The mended bird, perched now upon the kitchen windowsill where the morning light could trace the delicate filigree of its scars, became more than an object. It became a quiet revolution. Its presence seemed to change the very air in the Blackwood house, softening edges that had been sharp with grief for over a year. It was a constant, visible promise that broken things could be made whole, that care could restore what had been shattered. In the days that followed its return, the cautious dance that had characterized the household began to transform into something warmer, something far more genuine. The invisible barrier that had separated Anya, the hired help from the family she served, began to dissolve like mist under a strengthening sun. Lily, once a silent shadow, now became Anya's tiny apprentice. She would drag a chair across the kitchen floor to stand beside Anya at the counter, her small hands eager to help knead dough for bread or stir the bubbling contents of a pot. Her questions, once locked away inside her, now tumbled out in a steady, cheerful stream. "Why do we add salt? Can I taste the sauce? Will you teach me to braid like that?" Anya answered each query with infinite patience, her instructions gentle and clear, her praise for a job well done delivered with a sincerity that made Lily's face glow with pride. The little girl no longer just followed. She sought out Anya's company, finding comfort in her steady presence, learning from her capable hands. The wooden bird was always nearby, a silent witness to this new, blossoming connection. Ben's transformation was more subtle, but no less significant. The wariness in his eyes, the defensive posture of a boy trying to be a man, gradually eased. He began to seek Anya out, not for help with chores, but for conversation. He would find her in the garden, weeding between the rows of vegetables, and tell her about a hawk he'd seen hunting over the north pasture, or a problem he was having with a tricky calf. He listened to her advice not as orders, but as the wisdom he had been desperately missing. One afternoon, he brought her his fishing rod, its line tangled into an impossibly complex knot. Instead of sighing or telling him to be more careful, she simply took it, sat down on the porch steps, and with a calm focus that fascinated him, began to work at the snarl with her clever fingers. She didn't just untangle it. She showed him how she was doing it, teaching him the patience required to solve such a problem. He watched, and he understood that she was teaching him about more than just fishing line. Thomas observed all of this from a distance, his own heart undergoing a quiet upheaval. He watched Anya with his children, and he saw not a servant, but a natural-born mother. He saw the way she listened to Ben, really listened, her head tilted in concentration, making the boy feel that his thoughts were valuable. He saw the way she could calm Lily's occasional storms of temper, not with sternness, but with a quiet word and a distracting task. He saw how she had not just cleaned his house, but had breathed life back into it. The smell of bread was the smell of comfort. The tidy rooms were a testament to order and care. The sound of his children's laughter, a sound he had feared was lost to him forever, was now a regular music within these walls. And he saw her, too, not just as a worker, but as a woman. He saw the strength in her slender frame, the kindness in her eyes, the quiet dignity with which she carried her own sorrow. He found himself looking for her in a room, enjoying the simple sound of her voice. The loneliness that had been his constant companion began to recede, not with a dramatic fanfare, but with the gentle, persistent pressure of her presence, like a warm stone placed against a cold ache. The idea, once a terrifying and impossible thought, began to take root in his mind, nurtured by every small kindness, every shared smile, every evidence of her essential goodness. It was a risk, a gamble of the heart that could lead to the most beautiful of futures or the most painful of rejections. But the sight of his children thriving, of his house becoming a home, made the risk seem not only necessary, but vital. He decided the moment had come on an evening that felt suspended in perfection. The supper had been a hearty vegetable soup with dumplings, and the mood around the table was easy and light. Lily had chattered about a ladybug she'd found, and Ben had recounted a story about one of the ranch dogs. Anya had smiled, a true, warm smile that reached her eyes, and in that moment, she looked not like a visitor, but like she belonged there, right in that very chair. After the meal, as Anya began to clear the plates, Thomas caught Ben's eye and gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. Ben's eyes widened, then filled with a determined understanding. He looked at his sister and nodded toward Anya. As Anya finished wiping the table, Ben and Lily approached her. They each took one of her hands, their small hands feeling so right nestled in hers. "Miss Anya," Ben said, his voice a little unsteady but clear. "Could you come outside with us for a minute? Papa wants to talk to you." Puzzled but compliant, Anya allowed herself to be led by the children out onto the porch where Thomas stood, the setting sun painting the sky behind him in a blaze of orange and purple. The air was cool and sweet with the scent of evening. The children positioned themselves beside their father, a united front. Ben took a deep breath, his courage visibly marshaling itself. Lily clung to his hand, her small face a mask of earnest hope. Thomas placed a reassuring hand on each of their shoulders. "Miss Anya," Ben began again, his formal address sounding strangely poignant coming from his young mouth. "We know you only came here to cook, and you're the best cook in the whole world." He swallowed hard. "But you're more than that. You fixed Lily's bird. You helped me with my sums. You make everything better." His words tumbled out, heartfelt and true. "The house feels like a home when you're in it." Lily, unable to contain herself any longer, let go of Ben's hand and took a small step forward, her blue eyes huge and pleading. "Please don't go away," she whispered, her voice trembling with the weight of her request. "Please stay, not just to cook. Please stay as our mother." There was a beat of absolute silence, filled only with the distant lowing of a cow and the frantic beating of 4 hopeful hearts. Thomas looked at Anya, his own eyes mirroring the raw hope in his children's. He found his voice, which was thick with emotion. "They've said what's been in my own heart, Anya. I asked you here for a job, but you've given us a gift far greater. You brought our family back to life. We would be honored. I would be honored if you would consider staying, not as our housekeeper, but as my wife, as their mother, as part of this family." The proposal hung in the air between them, simple, honest, and utterly profound. They stood there on the porch, the man, the widow, and the 2 children silhouetted against the dying embers of the day, everything balanced on the edge of her answer. The silence stretched, filled with the memory of honey biscuits, of mended shirts, of a shattered bird made whole, and the terrifying, beautiful possibility of a second chance. The silence that followed Thomas's question was not the empty, hollow silence that had once filled the valley cottage or the bleak, grieving silence of the ranch house in its darkest days. This silence was vast and deep, charged with the weight of a future waiting to be born. It was a silence that held 4 hearts suspended, beating in a nervous rhythm against the stillness of the evening. Anya stood on the porch, her hands still warm from the children's grasp, her eyes fixed on the three figures before her. The man, his face etched with a hope so raw it was almost painful to behold, his strong rancher's hands resting on the shoulders of his children as if drawing courage from them. The boy, trying so hard to be brave and steady, his young face a mirror of his father's earnest plea. The little girl, whose whispered request, "Please stay as our mother," still seemed to hang in the air like the most fragile and beautiful of melodies. In that expansive, heart-stopping moment, Anya's life did not flash before her eyes. Instead, she felt it. She felt the deep, cold loneliness of her cottage, the quiet agony of meals taken alone at a table set for one. She felt the profound silence that had been her only companion. And then, like a series of sunbeams breaking through a heavy cloud, she felt the memories of her time here. The warm, sweet smell of honey biscuits filling a cold kitchen. The feel of Lily's fine hair under her fingers as she braided it. The look of stunned gratitude on Ben's face when he discovered his mended shirt. The taste of shared meals around a table that had begun to feel like a family's table. The sight of Thomas's solemn nod of thanks over a slice of blackberry pie. And lastly, the image of the mended bird, its cracks not hidden but honored, made whole again by patience and love. She had come here to perform a task, to cook and to clean, to lose herself in work to escape her own sorrow. But in doing so, she had not escaped her grief. She had met it in the hearts of others and had begun, stitch by gentle stitch, to mend it alongside their own. She looked at them, this man and these children, and she saw not a replacement for the family she had lost, but the beautiful, unexpected offer of a new one. She saw a chance to use her hands not just for mending cloth and wood, but for building a life. The loneliness that had been a stone in her chest for so long began to dissolve, not with a dramatic crash, but with a gentle, warming thaw, replaced by a feeling so immense it made her breath catch in her throat. It was the feeling of belonging. It was the feeling of coming home after a long, cold journey to find a fire already lit and waiting for you. Tears welled in her eyes, not tears of sadness, but tears of a gratitude so profound it could find no other way to express itself. A soft, radiant smile broke through her quiet demeanor, transforming her face, making her eyes shine with a light that had been dormant for years. She did not need to speak or answer immediately. The smile said it all. But she knew words were needed. They had offered her their hearts. She must offer them her words. She knelt down on the worn wooden planks of the porch, opening her arms. With a cry of pure joy, Lily rushed into them first, burying her face in Anya's neck. Ben was only a half-step behind, his own careful composure crumbling as he wrapped his arms around both of them, his head resting against her shoulder. Anya held them tightly, these two children who had given her their trust, their fragile, hopeful hearts. She felt the solid, warm weight of them, and it felt like a gift she had never dared to dream of. She looked up at Thomas over their heads, her tears tracing clean paths down her cheeks. "A family," she said, her voice soft but clear as a bell in the twilight, "is not just about blood. It's not just about who you are born to. It is about love. It's about mending what is broken together. My heart was broken," she confessed, her gaze including all of them. "And yours were, too. They were shattered, just like Lily's bird. But together, we can make something whole. Together, we can make something beautiful again." "Yes," she whispered, her voice full of a fierce, loving certainty. "Yes, I will stay." The relief and joy that swept over Thomas's face was like the sun rising. He knelt then, too, joining the embrace, his large arms encircling all of them, holding his newfound family close. On that porch, as the stars began to prick the deep violet sky, a new family was forged not by paper or law, but by a choice, by a promise, and by a love that had grown as quietly and as surely as a seed in the dark earth, finally breaking into the light. Anya did stay. She did not just become their cook. She became Thomas's wife, a partner who stood by his side, her quiet strength a perfect balance to his. She became Ben and Lily's mother, reading them stories at night, soothing their fears, celebrating their triumphs, her love for them growing deeper and more fierce with every passing day. Thomas learned to laugh again, a rich, full sound that echoed in the fields and brought smiles to the faces of his ranch hands. He learned to love again, his heart, once shrouded in grief, now open and full of a profound gratitude for the second chance he had been given. The ranch was never quiet and sad again. It was filled with the sounds of life, of children laughing, of shared conversations around the supper table, of the comfortable silence of two people working side by side. The smell of baking bread was a permanent, welcoming fixture in the air, a symbol of a home that was finally, truly lived in and loved. Anya had arrived a lonely widow, hired only to cook, but she had found a purpose far greater than any job. She had found a family to love, and in doing so, she had built a home for them all, proving that the greatest families are often those we find along the way, built stitch by stitch, kindness by kindness, with a love that makes broken things beautifully whole. If you enjoyed this story of kindness and finding a new family, please like, subscribe, and share this tale with others.